Today I'm going to talk about dealing with missed lifts in training. This is a topic that is not just programming, but more of like an overall philosophy from a coach's perspective, or overall kind of program design stuff. There probably isn't a right or wrong answer here. So a lot of this stuff is really just a matter of what you are okay with, what your intentions are as a coach. And the big question really is how much missing is acceptable in training. That's what we're trying to answer. And everyone's strategy is going to be a little bit different, whether you're more aggressive, more conservative. You have to answer that for yourself as a coach or an athlete. Which one is the what's the best track or course for you. There's obviously some definite drawbacks or advantages to certain methods and certain sort of styles there in terms of how much missing you're going to tolerate. But again, it's just really more of a personal decision. So first and foremost, what are the root causes of misses? Are you missing significantly large percentages of your total number of reps because of technique breakdown? Are you missing a large percentage of your reps because of excessive fatigue? From a technique breakdown standpoint, if you're missing lots and lots of lifts because your technique is falling apart or your technique is not solidified, then that's a major error to continue training that way. You're just going to reinforce bad technique again and again and again because you're basically, reinforcing misses, and the thing that's going to be solidified is the thing you do most often. And if missing is that thing, then you're going down that road. The other side would be excessive fatigue. If the amount of reps you're missing in training is a result of excessive fatigue, and not just on the day, if there's a systemic fatigue that is too high, meaning your training is too intense or too voluminous, or there's just too much training going on, and that's causing you to miss, then you basically have this kind of junk volume in there that's producing a poor result. You're training too hard, you're training too much, and it's affecting your technique. It's affecting your ability to make successful lifts. So that's a definite red flag if you're so tired all the time that you can't make successful lifts. The third kind of point there would be taking lifts that you can't make. If you're trying lifts all the time that are really outside of your physical preparation, whether it's a lift you've made before is not as important as the fact that are you prepared to lift that weight on that day. If your best snatch is 100 kilos and you're taking shots at 98 or 95 all the time, you might not be in shape to do those. So you're basically putting yourself in a place where you're just asking too much of yourself, too early, whatever in the cycle to be successful. So a huge component there. Taking, the program needs to be designed in a way that it can be performed. If the program is too hard or too difficult or too heavy or demanding too much of you, then it's not going to work well. The psychological effect of missing too often, I think, is kind of maybe overlooked by some, maybe emphasized too much by others. But a couple of points about that are the fear of failure, right? If you're missing all the time, then you're setting yourself up to believe that you're going to miss, right? If you go in your heavy days or you're training, throughout the week and you're missing 20 or 30% of your heavy snatches, things over 90%, you're re-ingraining the fact that you're going to fail at those weights, I would be willing to venture that the people who miss the most in training are also the people that miss the most in competition. And part of that, I think, is a psychological thing where you've basically created this fear of failing, or this fear that it's kind of like you're gonna train, you're gonna go to meet, and you have to expect missing, and so you're afraid of what's gonna happen at the meet because you miss a lot. and it's just a bad situation to be in. The next thing would be like negative self dialogue. The more you miss, some people, the more they miss, they start to become negative, and they discuss, in their internal dialogue, they start to degrade themselves or start to get frustrated, and they think it's being critical or think that it's being like a tough love scenario. But really what they're doing is just reinforcing, they're kicking you while you're down, so to speak. They're just reinforcing this bad behavior in a way that's not productive. You miss a bunch of lifts, then you talk about how shitty you are as a person or a lifter. I always fail, or this is just the way everything in my life goes. That's not productive. It's not going to help you, because it just beats you down when you're already feeling bad. So that's a huge psychological thing, is to ensure that you're not, even if you are missing, that you're not hypercritical, or you're not hyper sensitive to failures, right? You can miss a bunch of lifts, you can walk away and be fine and come back. You could have the same outcome of a workout. You could miss 10 of your lifts and have a positive twist on it and turn around and say, hey, now I know what's wrong. I'm going too heavy, or this is wrong. I can fix that. Or you can walk away and say, oh, it's because I'm a bad person and I'm a terrible lifter and I should quit. One of those scenarios is going to lead to somebody probably getting better, and the other is going to lead to them probably staying in the same place. And then the final one, which is kind of the opposite of these, is that if you're missing a lot, the sort of opposite side of that would be like a delusional self-image, where you're missing a ton of lifts all the time, but they're quote unquote training makes, or it was close. And then you consistently walk around believing you're capable of more than you are, because you were close to that lift in training. This is huge for things like press outs and missing behind, or it's kind of the same thing as like if you're wearing straps and you snatched 100 kilos, and your best ever is 98 without straps, then you're gonna feel like, oh shit, okay, like I can snatch 100, but it's really not 100. You're 100 with straps. If you snatch 95 kilos from the floor and that's your best, and you snatch 105 from the blocks, those are two different things. They need to be treated as such. And the same thing happens with misses, where if you're missing 105 behind you 6 times, but you snatched 100, like you're still a 100 kilo snatcher. But the idea that like, well, I'm really close to that, or it's close, or it's good, or you press it out a bunch, or it's like, don't let lots of misses at big weights trick you into thinking that you're gonna make big weights. And that's tough, because while half of the puzzle is there, right? If you miss 105 behind and your best is 100, well, shit, it seems like you can do 100, it seems like you can do 105, but you really can't, because you didn't make it. And that's a big thing, a trap that people fall into, where they're totally okay with lots of misses as long as things are really close to their best, and they use that as an approximation for their actual physical preparation, their actual state of readiness, when it really isn't a good indicator. It's a good indicator of how strong you are, but it's not a good indicator of your sport form or of what your results at a meet are going to be. So I think that's a kind of a big problem, more for the overconfident, that you're allowing lots of misses to sort of dictate what you believe is successful, or what you believe you can accomplish on the platform. And it's a suicide mission in that regard. And then the opposite end of the spectrum from missing all the time, right? How much missing is acceptable in training? That implies that some missing is going to happen, and I think we can all agree that that's definitely the case. You're going to miss lifts. If you weren't missing, you probably aren't training, as hard as you possibly can. You should be really close to the limit of your abilities. So misses are going to happen. And the opposite end of the spectrum is shying away from that, being too conservative, never missing ever in training. This taken to its extreme is something that can be self-limiting, where you're just so concerned with pushing yourself harder or going a little bit heavier that you don't miss, or that you don't go hard enough ever in training because you're afraid of missing. And that's just going to end up in a situation where you're not going to maximize the last, let's say, 5% of your potential, because, you don't push quite beyond the envelope. You don't push the envelope hard enough. And so you end up in a place where it's like, oh, okay, like, I'm always a little bit too underperforming, and I never really got to that far edge of what I can do. I will say that, having said that, it's probably better to be on this side of the coin, because generally most people are missing probably too much in training, especially, athletes that are really driven. They're going to train hard. They're going to push themselves. And then the last would be like, the last kind of side of that being too conservative is leading to totally unrealistic expectations of yourself. Very similar to having negative self-talk, very similar to, all the negatives that can happen from too much missing, is the idea that if you never miss in training, that, you might be putting some kind of expectations on your technical skills that are ridiculous. That, you're thinking that your technique has to be absolutely flawless or immaculate in order to improve, and you can have this sort of no missing as a badge of honor that kind of turns into a crutch, where it really is just an excuse, or it's a scenario where you're trapped in this, like, I can't miss because then my technique's bad, and if my technique's bad, I'm not going to lift any weight. And so you're always going in this cycle of like trying to constantly improve or retool your technique, and end up in a place where you're not going to make any progress. So from my standpoint, I would summarize by saying the amount of misses in training that is acceptable is one that allows the greatest rate of progress with the least negative impact to your results. The least negative impact is difficult to define, but if the number of misses you have in the gym starts to creep into a number that is starting to impact your performance on the platform, then you have a problem. If you miss, 10 out of every 1,000 snatches, and you go to competition and you're going 5 for 6, 6 for 6, or I guess, 3 for 3 on most occasions, you're doing fine. If that number climbs up to 20 reps out of 1,000, and you start missing, you start going 1 for 3 or 2 for 3, then I would say you've creeped into that area where it's too much. So as an absolute number, it's difficult to define, but if the number of misses in training increases and you see that impact on the platform, you have a problem. And then conversely, if you're not making progress on the platform, and your training is not adequate, is being kept suboptimal in terms of intensity and volume because you're avoiding misses, then start pushing that up, that volume and intensity up, until you start to see maybe a couple more misses here and there in training, and then move from there. Not that missing is necessarily a good gauge as to your progress or as to your training results, but give yourself more leeway. And then practical tips would be, first and foremost, keep an accurate log, record missed lifts. If you don't know how many you're missing, it's probably different than you expect. It's probably different than your interpretation. You might believe you're not missing a lot, or you might believe you don't miss that often, and then when you actually write it down, you're like, wow, I missed 35% of my snatches this week. So accurate logbook's the first step. Second, establish an appropriate range of missed lift ratios to like a missed lifts as a ratio of misses to make. Establish that guideline before you proceed. Set a high standard with low expectations. So that means, decide that, hey, I'm not going to allow myself to miss more than 5% of my lifts in any one training month. Okay, great. But that's the standard, but have the expectation that you might not reach that right away. That might be something where you start at 10% misses and you're working your way down towards that 5. Don't just start with extremely high standards, like I'm going to miss nothing, and then when you start missing, get upset because your expectations are outrageous. So high standards, low expectations, and work toward that ideal number. And then, the biggest thing here, all this whole topic really summed up in one thing, is frame your thinking around success, right? But develop a strategy to deal with unexpected circumstances. That's 90% of coaching, 90% of training, right? You write a program that you believe is going to be doable. You write a program that's manageable, and you write a program that you think is going to create success. and you framed your whole thinking around that, and then also have in place a strategy to deal with circumstances that you don't expect to happen, right? You write a great program, the best program in the world, and then when it falls apart, you have to have a plan, a strategy to manage that process. A lot of times people only have the first part. They've created the best program in the world. It falls apart. They don't know what to do. They blame the athlete. They blame the coach. They blame all sorts of other circumstances, when the reality is that you just don't have the contingency plan in place to manage that. Hey, plan is this. This is the best plan I ever wrote. Great. What's the plan? What do we do when we miss? What do we do when things aren't going well? Well, then we do, plan B, C, and D if that happens. And those things should all be, designed in principle to augment what was going to happen in the first place, So that's kind of the gist of, how much missing is acceptable, what to do, how to manage it, what can really happen there. So thanks for listening.